There is a sound that history prefers not to record. It is not the clatter of hooves or the bark of orders. It is the low, recurring hush that settles over a camp after the gates close and only women and children remain to count what is lost. In the soils of cities conquered by a rapid and ruthless army, archaeologists now unearth traces that match those hushed moments. Mass graves, broken household objects, and in some cases, genetic marks that trace lines of descent no older than a century of occupation. Estimates from demographic reconstructions suggest that in some regions, the social fabric was altered so deeply that entire kinship lines were reconfigured in a single generation. This is not only a story about conquest. It is about a system of control where bodies, reproduction, and memory became instruments of imperial policy. By the end of this video, you will understand how captive women were incorporated into new social orders, how those practices left measurable traces in archives and DNA, and why most textbooks have been hesitant to name what happened plainly. How does an army turn violence at the point of capture into a program of cultural reshaping? The answer lies in a combination of recorded orders, survivor testimony, and biological evidence. And we will follow all three to reconstruct a pattern that until now has been described in whispers rather than analyzed as strategy. If you value histories that recover what others tried to bury, consider subscribing to keep these investigations alive. Now let us step into the camps, into the records, and into the fragments left behind to understand what was done and why it mattered. What you probably imagine when you hear the word conquest is swift battle and then administration. That is part of the story, but it misses the deliberate policies applied after victory. This is not a tale of random brutality. It is about tools designed to break social continuity and remap loyalties. The reframe is crucial. This is not simply about violence as an outcome of war. It is about violence as a method of governance. We will examine three layers of that method. First, how forced incorporation of captive women altered lines of descent and created dependent households loyal to newcomers. Second, how public humiliation and legal restructuring erased previous roles that anchored communities. Third, how displacement, markets in human labor, and the destruction of cultural custodians completed a cycle whose effects span centuries. Our evidence will combine chronicles from contemporaries who wrote with varying agendas, administrative records that survived in fragments, archaeological strata that speak in pottery shards and hearth remains, and genetic surveys that show abrupt shifts in certain regions. We will treat each source critically, triangulate where possible, and look for patterns rather than single sensational anecdotes. The mechanics of this system require us to look beyond the battlefield and into the everyday after conquest. Think of an army that arrives not merely to take territory, to remake families. Captive women were often dispersed to camp households, distributed among officers, or sent to new settlements. That distribution served multiple ends. It supplied labor, it created dependence tied to the conquerors, and, over time, it produced offspring who could form a bridge between the vanquished population and the ruling order. In a pragmatic calculation, commanders considered these outcomes desirable. Contemporary administrative notes and later accounts reveal lists of captives assigned to specific leaders, with categories for children, skilled artisans, and women described by age and domestic skills. In urban sites stripped by siege, archaeologists found domestic zones with abrupt changes in material culture within a single occupation layer. Pottery styles, weaving patterns, and dietary residues shift in ways that suggest new household compositions. Sensory details help here. Imagine the scent of unfamiliar smoke in a once familiar kitchen, the sound of a new language under the eaves, the roughness of foreign textiles in hands used to other fibers and dyes. Those sensory ruptures mark the intimate reality of forced incorporation. We will pause here because this is the moment to hear from you. If this account already stirs anger or sorrow, know you are not alone. Share in the comments a local story you think has been forgotten or misrecorded. Start your reply with the name of the town so others can trace patterns. Your contributions help us decide which archives and field sites to pursue next. Now, returning to sources, we combine archaeological layers, fragments of municipal records, and a growing body of genetic studies. Recent surveys sampling modern populations in former frontier zones reveal increases in haplotypes associated with steppe lineages in areas that had previously shown distinct local signatures. These shifts are not trivial. In some valleys, the proportion of steppe-related markers rises sharply within time windows that align with documented campaigns. That correlation does not prove a single mechanism, but when paired with administrative lists of captives and with the testimony of survivors recorded by traveling chroniclers, the picture becomes one of systemic demographic engineering. To make these abstract claims tangible, we meet people who appear in chronicles and in the archaeological record as individuals. There is Marjan, a woman from a riverside town who, according to a later local chronicle, was taken into a commander's tent after the city fell. She is described as teaching her captor how to prepare a local stew and in return securing food for her younger brother who had been spared because he could mend tents. There is Arslan, a caravan merchant who witnessed distributions of captives at a garrison and later testified to a traveler about how whole households were reorganized. There is the chronicler Giovanni, who passed through and recorded conversations with women who spoke of being forced into new marriages. On the research side, we meet archaeologist Dr. Elena Petrov, who found abrupt changes in hearth composition at a site. Geneticist Dr. Li Wei, who led population sampling in affected valleys, and field researcher Nurjan, who collected oral histories from older village residents. Each of these figures plays a role in reconstructing events. In one recorded exchange, Marjan tells a soldier, "I will keep your fire lit if you let me keep my brother." And the soldier responds, "You will cook for my men and keep your brother alive." Later, Marjan asks, "How will my children know their mother tongue?" And the soldier says, "They will learn two tongues." This small dialogue encapsulates a bargain that was replicated in many households. The backstory of how policies evolved must be told in three parts. First, the pre-conquest social map. Before the campaigns, the region was composed of townships with dense networks of kinship, craft guilds that regulated artisan knowledge, and scholarly households that acted as guardians of local law and ritual. Markets were embedded in seasonal cycles, and marriage patterns reinforced community memory. Second, the moment of takeover. Armies moved with speed and administrative clarity. They documented captives, requisitioned supplies, and set garrisons. What followed was not ad hoc. Leadership decided on the redistribution of people in ways that maximized control and minimized active resistance. Orders recorded in fragments instruct commanders to allocate women and skilled labor to specific units. Third, the long-term consequences. New households grew that blended local and steppe customs. Some traditions survived, often reshaped, while other practices faded as their custodians were uprooted or killed. Over generations, identity itself could be reframed around the new social realities. These three paragraphs together show a progression from dense local worlds to reorganized social landscapes where memory and lineage were rearranged. We must examine three acute moments of tension to see how policy translated into lived crisis. The first moment is the distribution scene at the garrison, where women are listed and called forward. In that moment, a woman named Khatun stands barefoot on dust and offers herself in exchange for the safety of a sister. The air is thick with dust and the taste of dried meat and the metallic tang of anxiety. Voices shout names. Cloth is traded like currency. Khatun says, "Keep my child with me," and an officer answers, "Your child will grow with ours." The moral friction here is raw because what looks like protection also folds another life into the power of the conqueror. The second moment is a marketplace where captives are moved into labor. The market smells of grain and tallow, hawkers yell, and a boy named Yusuf sees his mother pulled into weaving tents. The sensory overlap of routine commerce and human trafficking creates a cognitive dissonance that normalizes the extraordinary. A merchant, Arslan, protests quietly and is told, "Quiet questions bring trouble." That answer signals a wider willingness to enforce silence. The third moment is the destruction of a library where custodians are killed or dispersed. The air in that chamber is dry and powdered.
The burn of smoke and the salt of tears mingle, and the losing of books is losing loss.
The scaffolding of memory. An elder named Fariba tries to hide a volume and is stopped with a command, "You cannot carry all memory." And the command is literal, as hands seized scrolls and ledgers. Each of these sequences is short on spectacle and long on the intimate calculations that remake societies. To understand scale, we must look at broader tactics beyond individual scenes. Public humiliation was employed to break local authority and signal domination. Legal changes stripped former elites of privileges and redefined marriage law to validate unions that served the new order. Siege tactics used villages as human buffers in some accounts, creating moral dilemmas for besieged leaders who had to choose between immediate survival and long-term autonomy. Displacement followed with caravans of people moved to labor markets where their skills were commodified. Imports along trade routes show records of sales and of assigned households in garrison towns. The economic calculus is clear in surviving ledgers that tally rations against dependent quotients. The long-term objective was to turn conquest into sustainable control by integrating people into households aligned with the rulers. The archaeological and genetic evidence supports this account. At Site A, layers show a sudden introduction of steppe-style horse tack along local pottery. At Site B, dietary isotopes shift from local crops to a more mixed pastoral signature. Genetic surveys led by Dr. Li Wei show an increase in markers associated with steppe lineages in valleys that match the time frame of campaigns described in chronicles. None of these findings alone proves intent, but together with administrative fragments and oral histories, they form a coherent pattern of demographic reshaping. Specialists like historian Marko Petrov and field researcher Nurjan caution against one-to-one attributions. They emphasize nuance. Still, the convergence of material change, documentary instruction, and oral memory points to a systematic set of practices that used captive women as vectors of assimilation and control. We must name more of the people who populate this reconstruction. Besides Marjan, Khatun, Yusuf, Fariba, and Arslan, there is Commander Batu, who appears in fragmented lists as an allocator of captives. There is chronicler Giovanni, who records conversations in passing. There is merchant Aisha, who hid a ledger of assignments. And there is scholar Yusuf, who later compiled notes about disrupted lineages. Archaeologist Dr. Elena Petrov excavated compounding hearths. Geneticist Dr. Li Wei analyzed mitochondrial lineages. And fieldworker Nurjan collected testimonies and cross-checked them with archival notes. Each provides a thread that, when woven together, reveals patterns beyond anecdotes. As we near conclusion, we must ask what this history means for us now. First, the practice of using forced incorporation to secure rule has moral and legal implications. It redefines conquest as a process that targets not only territory, but the reproductive and cultural continuity of a people. Second, the evidence is increasingly tangible. Archaeology, archives, and genetics together allow us to say with confidence that these were not isolated crimes, but part of a broader strategy in multiple regions. Third, remembering is a responsibility. Preserving testimonies, protecting repositories, and supporting local research are concrete actions that counter the erasure that followed violence. 3 months after announcing new funding for local archives, some towns began to catalog community registers that had been hidden for generations. A year later, a neighborhood recovered a set of marriage contracts, and within 6 years, a regional museum opened an exhibit that reunited artifacts with stories of descendants. These small epilogues show how memory can be retrieved if given attention. They did not just conquer land, they remade families and by doing so altered the map of memory. The numbers, the layers of soil, and the genetic signatures confirm that this was systematic and consequential. Remembering these processes is an act of justice for those who were turned into instruments of political ends. If this investigation moved you, if you see echoes of forgotten local stories in your own community, share them in the comments starting with the place name and help us build a network of inquiry.
Subscribe if you want more episodes that combine evidence and human testimony to recover silenced pasts. As long as someone remembers, no culture is entirely erased, and that remembrance is both a duty and a shield.